There's not sufficient evidence at this stage to limit sodium intake. So when we say salt, we normally talk about sodium chloride, and the sodium is what people get concerned about. Just for an example, in I think it was September of 2017, the Australian Dietary Guidelines removed any upper limit for sodium intake for individuals. That means that I can now tell you to have as much salt as you would like and not be in contravention of the Australian Dietary Guidelines. Trouble is the fluid volume of your blood is governed by how much sodium you have. And if you don't have enough sodium in your blood vessels, then number one, you'll often feel thirsty because your body's saying, we need more fluid, we don't have enough fluid, so you'll drink a lot. But then because you don't have the sodium, remember the sodium's necessary to hold the fluid inside your blood vessels, so you'll end up urinating it out. So people on ketogenic diets, because you often need more salt on ketogenic diets, if they're finding that they're constantly thirsty and they're urinating a lot, so when they drink, it just passes out, it's often a sodium deficiency. And one of the other major symptoms people will feel is that if they stand up quickly, they'll feel dizzy because their blood pressure isn't enough to maintain the blood pressure going up to the brain. You're basically starving the brain of oxygen, of its blood supply. So they're two common symptoms of sodium deficiency, easily fixed just by having more sodium in the diet. Well, fructose directly contributes to insulin resistance. So we've got some beautiful studies where they've actually had groups of children who have been consuming a lot of sugar, which is 50% fructose, 50% glucose. And they've taken out the fructose, but they've basically replaced it with same amounts of glucose. So the total carbohydrates have stayed the same, but the fructose has reduced. And in those studies, even very short periods in the space of, just over a week, they've been able to demonstrate significant reductions in liver fat. And have no doubt that liver fat is, fatty liver is a direct cause of insulin resistance. Now, if you have insulin resistance, we said before, that means that insulin's not working properly. So then your body will increase the level of insulin. Now, the thing about insulin not working properly is it's very tissue specific. So while it might not work as it normally does in your muscle tissue, helping your muscles to take sugar out of circulation, it can still work relatively well at the fat level. So help your fat stores take sugar out. And it can still work quite well at the kidney level. And one of the jobs of insulin at the kidney level is to actually hold on to sodium. So that's actually a much more important factor for increasing the sodium in your body and causing high blood pressure than is the amount of sodium that you consume. If you consume a modicum of sodium but have very high insulin levels, your body's going to try very hard to hold on to all of that sodium. You can, on the other hand, consume a whole lot of sodium, but have very good low insulin levels, and any excess sodium that you consume will just come out in your urine. High insulin levels prevent that from happening effectively. So for a long time, I used to believe that omega-6 fats were inherently inflammatory. And now I don't, because if we actually look, there's studies of supplementing with arachidonic acid and this kind of thing that actually shows that it actually enhances muscle bulk and muscle strength, and they don't appear to be negative in the right situation. And the right situation is a low inflammatory environment. So the problem with omega-6s, or the problem with our old thinking, was that we thought you ingest this omega-6 fat, and then it gets turned into arachidonic acid, and then that arachidonic acid can be turned into these inflammatory products downstream. Arachidonic acid is not converted into these inflammatory products in the absence of an inflammatory stimulus. So if you're in a low inflammatory state, your arachidonic acid is just sitting there, and it can produce good things, but it won't produce these bad things. And in actual fact, when we put people, there's one study I know of that actually looked at arachidonic acid levels on a low-carb diet, which we know is a low-inflammation diet, and they actually found that arachidonic acid levels increased. And that fully supports this view that there's less conversion of arachidonic acid into these negative products. And the reason that all these vegetable and seed oils are associated with bad health is not in essence because they're high in omega-6, it's because they're high in oxidized products. So when you have any fat, for it to be liquid, it has to have double bonds between carbons. The more double bonds, the more liquid it is. So basically the liquidity or solidity of a fat is proportional and a good surrogate marker for how saturated or unsaturated it is. And any fat that has these double bonds between carbons is prone to oxidation. And that can be omega-3 fats just as much as omega-6 fats. And this is critical to understand because people supplementing with fish oil, they're not necessarily doing themselves a service. And they did a study a couple of years back in Australia, so went around to 2 different pharmacies in Sydney, local here, and bought all the available fish oil supplements that didn't have additives to them and measured their oxidation state. And every single one of them had was oxidized. So fish oil is not safe. So the premise is that if you want to avoid oxidized fat, then you better get it from food, because the definition of oxidized fats in food is rancidity. If you are not going to eat something that's rancid, then you're probably not going to be ingesting high levels of oxidized fat. So if you want your omega-3s, have some salmon that's not rotten. Have some grass-fed beef that's fresh. So, and you'll also get your omega-6s this way as well. And the problem is that when we ingest, say, if we have a vegetable or seed oil, this just forms the largest part of oils in our diet, and that's why we get most of these oxidized products. They get absorbed through our chylomicrons. They attack the liver. We also know that these oils are oxidized incredibly quickly. So even within a matter of hours, there was one paper I read on walnut oil, and I think it was tested 6 hours after harvest. It already had significant amounts of oxidation. So even if you're buying, single press extra virgin olive oil that's kept in a cool cupboard that's in a brown jar, it's not going to be enough. It's still going to be oxidized. And olive oil is something that surprises a lot of people. Remember we said it's liquid because it's got a double bond? Well, 70% of olive oil is oleic acid or omega-9, which has a single double bond, and that double bond is still prone to oxidation. So even olive oil doesn't get a pass. So if you want to work out what the safest oil is to have, or safest fat, well, the basic thing is it should be solid at room temperature. The more solid it is, that's a really good surrogate marker for the less double bonds, less prone to oxidation. And one more key point here is you have to strictly control your blood sugar levels. I did a study looking at oxidized oil intake and how much was actually taken up into the body in a group of well-controlled diabetics and poorly controlled diabetics and healthy people. And what they actually found is that the level of oxidized products that ended up in your system in the poorly controlled diabetics was significantly greater, order of magnitude greater than in people who were either well controlled or didn't have diabetes in the first place. And we know this makes sense because fluctuations in your blood sugar levels actually does generate oxidative stress within the mitochondria. So we've got evidence of this as well. So what I'm now recommending for my patients is that they avoid any liquid fat, including fish oil. And if they want to make sure they get their fish oil, it's got to be from fresh food. And that includes not having olive oil. And if they still are having any oils at all, it's absolutely essential that they have strict blood sugar control.